The principle of variation. The exact duration and amplitude of a cycle can vary. It is not fixed. The number of smaller cycles that make up a cycle could also vary. The position of a cycle peak relative to its two lows may also vary. Anything that can vary will vary. Key aspects. Market volatility is a key factor in determining the amplitude of a market cycle. Individual news items may cause large distortions in a single cycle. Cycle duration can vary by as much as 50% in normal circumstances. Variation is mean reverting. Over time, cycle durations will average out. A period of longer than average duration will give way to a period of shorter than average durations. I believe this is the most important principle of all 7 that you need to internalize. Everything we have seen so far, the principle of synchronicity, summation, all of the things that we just discussed can vary. This is the most important one to me. Cycle duration can vary by as much as 50% in normal circumstances. That means that if I take an 80-day cycle, it is perfectly normal for it to last between 40 and 120 days. A 40-day cycle can be anywhere between 20 and 60 days. And by the way, normal variation is 50%. It can be longer than that. I have seen 80-day cycles go on as long as 140 days. But when I say there's an 80-day cycle that can vary in duration, well, why do I call it an 80-day cycle? I call it an 80-day cycle because over time, its duration will be, on average, 80 days. Very important concept for you to internalize. Cycle durations can and will vary, but they are mean reverting. Usually, for example, in a bear market, the 80-day cycle can extend up to 100 days on average, but then that gives way to a neutral period when the 80-day cycle is significantly shorter, coming in at about 60 days. If you average these two periods out, the consolidation or the accumulation period before a bull market and the bear market, the average of these cycles will be 80 days. And this is what I said here, a period of longer than average durations will give way to a period of shorter than average duration. The other one is that market volatility is a factor determining the amplitude of a cycle. Remember, the amplitude of a cycle is how much it goes from low to high. This can vary significantly. During a powerful bull market, an 80-day cycle in crypto assets, for example, can take the price up 200-300%. In a bear market, an 80-day cycle from low to high may be 15%. It's not as big of a deal as you might expect in finding these cycles. Volatility tends to be somewhat stable. By that, I mean that sometimes volatility is high, and when that happens, you know to expect big moves. When market volatility is low, you can expect cycles to be a bit more muted. Now, I thought I would show you a practical example. Up until now, whenever I discussed synchronicity, summation, any principle, I used what I call ideal cycles. These are perfectly regular cycles that come in at exactly the amount of time you would expect. There was no variation whatsoever. When we apply the principle of summation to add all these cycles together, yes, the final picture looks a little closer to a real market, but you could see that it's a bit too symmetrical. It's a bit too perfect. So here's an example with gold. So as you can see, this is the real 40-day cycle in gold during 2020, 2021. And this is a real 80-day cycle on gold as extracted from the price action using my computer model from gold as well. And what you will notice is these are not perfect. These vary significantly. Now remember, this is a 40-day cycle. So on average, these lows are 40 days apart, believe it or not. This is maybe no longer than 15 days. This one is quite long. This one was probably closer to 80 days in duration. This is what real cycles look like when we take into account the principle of variation. Here's the other cycle that I extracted. I extracted the 80-day cycle on gold. Here's one, here's another, and here's another. And you notice that if these two are roughly similar, this is probably roughly 80 days each, but this one is a lot shorter than that. The principle of variation allows for this. This is why there's a theoretical perfect cycle with equally spaced lows and highs. And then there's the actual cycles when the lows are not equally spaced apart. And likewise, notice that the highs do not come in at the midpoint. So this one came in the second half of the cycle, this high. In this case, the high came in the first half of the cycle. This one is roughly symmetrical. However, it is a lot shorter than usual. This is the principle of variation at work. Cycles vary, and they vary significantly. The last key aspect of a cycle's variation is its amplitude. I don't know if you noticed, but these two cycles that I just showed you, the rally component is always the same. In both cases, I showed it as if every time the market goes up, it goes up the same amount. And when it goes down the same amount. Same for the 80-day cycle. However, the principle of variation also tells us that the amplitude of the cycle, the amount of price movement that you see within the cycle, varies, and it can vary significantly, which is why I added another chart. And this is real live price action. Using one of the indicators I'm going to show you later in this course, I isolated the 80-day cycle on Bitcoin. This is actually in 2015. This is the 80-day cycle. Look at this cycle. In between these two large, call it average 80-day cycles, we have another 80-day cycle. It's a lot shorter. And the amount of price movement that you saw within this cycle is about 20%, as opposed to about 200% for these two. This is well within the normal variation of the 80-day cycle in the case of crypto. In the stock market or in gold, commodities, bigger markets, you don't see as much variation in terms of price, but in crypto, you do. Another one that is quite important is that individual news items may cause large distortions in a single cycle. Even though this is not exactly what we mean in the principle of variation, let's call it, there's normal variation as described by the principle of variation, and then there's the abnormal variation caused by large distortions based on news item. If war breaks out or a pandemic or a natural disaster, you may see prices move far more than they usually would within a small cycle. Given the nature of these distortions, given the fact that they're being caused by something fundamental in the real world, you can tell when it's happening. As an example, going back to March of 2020, when I was trading crypto actively, cycles were being distorted by the COVID panic. I understood very well that I was seeing a distortion in the price action. I even took advantage of it. In a future lesson, I'm going to show you exactly how I did so. Going back to the beginning, to wrap things up, cycles vary, and they vary significantly. Now, there's normal variation, which I'm showing you here in this Bitcoin chart, and there's abnormal variation, which is caused by one-of-a-kind, one-off natural disasters, black swan events. These will also distort cycles, but it will be far beyond what you would expect in a normal variation cycle. However, keep in mind that even in normal circumstances, cycles can and will vary, sometimes significantly.